The backdrop of suburban America and the obsession with crime. In America, the suburbs have long been romanticized as a safe haven, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of urban life. The quiet streets lined with cookie-cutter houses, the well-kept lawns, the neighborhood barbecues, and the sense of community made it seem like the perfect slice of the American dream. However, it's this very illusion of peace that makes suburban crime so chilling. The early 2000s marked a shift in how America viewed its suburbs. What were once considered sleepy, unthreatening communities began to harbor dark secrets. Beneath the surface of soccer games and PTA meetings, stories would emerge that shook those very foundations. It's almost as though when the curtain of tranquility is violently ripped away, the dissonance becomes too much to bear. That's when fear takes root and spreads. In a quiet suburb set against the backdrop of the Pacific Northwest, something sinister began to unfurl. This wasn't New York City or Los Angeles. It was a small community where people didn't lock their doors, where neighbors borrowed sugar from one another, and where strange cars on your street became the talk of the town. It was the kind of place where threats felt hypothetical, until they weren't. The first signs of unease crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first it was whispers. A jogger finding something off in the overgrown field near the edge of town. A peculiar flyer appearing at the local community board about a missing woman. A dog barking furiously one night at the woods behind a cul-de-sac. Alone, these moments seemed mundane enough to shrug off. Together, they painted a much darker picture. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into full-blown terror. A series of bodies, women to be exact, started appearing. They weren't discovered in alleyways or abandoned buildings like you'd expect in a major metropolitan city. No, these gruesome scenes were set in the most unassuming places. A soccer field that wasn't used in years. The stretch of woods where kids used to build forts. The edge of a lonely lake where families once picnicked but had since grown out of the habit. The victims had no discernible connection to one another at first glance, but the cause of death, a chilling mix of physical brutality and psychological derision, tied their fates together in a grotesque narrative. All of a sudden, the community felt suffocating. Streets that were once welcoming now carried a dark energy. People started locking their doors, installing floodlights, and double-checking their window latches. Parents wouldn't let their teenagers out after sundown. Neighborhood groups formed online, sharing every strange interaction, every scratched car door or suspicious van. Local media latched onto the story, sensationalizing it in ways only America's 24-hour news cycle could. News anchors dubbed it the work of a shadow predator, their foreboding headlines sprawled across TV screens during dinner time. True crime panels debated obscure details as the chilling words serial killer became blaring subtitles. Everyone had a theory. Some blamed vagrants, others pointed fingers at that one guy who always kept to himself. But the truth was, no one really had a clue. Fear turned neighbors into strangers. People started acting differently, less chatty at the mailbox, hesitant to pick up a fallen grocery list for the person in line ahead of them. For the police, the case was maddening. They were confronted with a methodical and cunning perpetrator who seemed to have an unsettling understanding of their every move. Red herrings and dead ends became the status quo. It amplified the growing dread that whoever was behind the killings wasn't just someone's creepy uncle or a disgruntled ex. They were orchestrating this, targeting the very fabric of suburban life, slowly dismantling the safety net people had wrapped themselves in. Most haunting of all, the locations of the bodies weren't chosen randomly. Every discovery felt deliberate, like breadcrumbs left by a sick mind playing a game no one else understood. Almost as if the quiet corners of suburbia, the forgotten spaces, became this killer's playground. How had it come to this? How does a picturesque neighborhood unspokenly become a breeding ground for such depravity? FBI profilers would later hypothesize that these suburban areas, with their isolation masked by a false sense of closeness, often attracted a particularly calculating type of predator. There was something about their silence, their sprawling woods, their slow-paced routines that offered cover for the kinds of things no one wanted to think about. And for this suburb in particular, the illusion that evil couldn't exist here shattered beyond repair. The predator knew these streets better than the residents themselves, and as body after body turned up, the fear morphed into obsession. Where was he? Could he be the guy checking out at the grocery counter behind you? Could the twisted imagination behind these crimes stem from the same person sipping coffee at the corner diner? Could he live 2 houses over? People stopped seeing their community as a refuge and started seeing it as a puzzle, one with pieces that didn't quite fit and corners that seemed permanently blurred. The idyllic postcard image of American suburbia, white picket fences, manicured shrubs, kids with lemonade stands, crumbled into a growing darkness that refused to lift. The smallness of the community, which had always been its strength, suddenly felt suffocating. Every mundane interaction now held a creeping suspicion, and at the heart of the whole ordeal was a simple question: why here? Why us? The unfolding series of horrific crimes. It all began on an unassuming October morning, when the crisp autumn air seemed to buzz with a strange uneasiness. As an older man strolled his golden retriever through the outskirts of town, he decided to take a detour near an overgrown field. It was the kind of place no one thought much about: wild grass as high as your waist, discarded wrappers rustling in the breeze, and the faint scent of damp earth. But today was different. Today, there was something acrid in the air that didn't quite belong. The dog was the first to react, pulling hard on its leash toward a clump of foliage. Its barking grew rapid and panicked, the way animals sense danger instinctively that humans can only register far too late. The man reluctantly followed, brushing aside the dense weeds, only to freeze in horror at what lay before him. There, half hidden by tangled vines and dirt, was the lifeless body of a woman, her skin already pale and bloated, her clothes torn and smeared with filth. The scene was so grotesque, so unnatural that it burned into his mind like a cruel photograph developing in his memory. He called the police immediately, his voice shaking, struggling to describe what he'd seen. The first responders, seasoned officers who had seen plenty in their time, were still taken aback. The decomposition suggested the woman had been there for some time, possibly several days. Her body bore clear signs of violence, vicious and deliberate. This was no tragic accident, no random misfortune. This was an act of pure malice. But this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Barely a week later, another body was found, this time by a group of teenagers cutting through a wooded area on their way home from school. They'd always heard urban legends about the woods being haunted, but this discovery tore it out of the realm of myth and placed it squarely in reality. Another woman, another scene of carnage. The pattern started emerging almost immediately. Females, all appearing to be in their late 30s or early 40s, their lives ended violently, their dignity stripped in ways too gruesome to repeat. By the time a third body was unearthed, this one abandoned near an old recreational soccer field, fear was gripping the town like a vice. This wasn't just a string of isolated incidents, this was a serial killer, the kind you read about in true crime books or watched in sprawling Netflix documentaries. But this time, it wasn't someone else's story happening far away. It was here, in their backyard, on their streets. Each body carried its own haunting signature. The women's injuries spoke of unthinkable cruelty, the kind that could only come from someone who derived pleasure from pain. Bruises formed like fingerprints on their necks, rope burns encircling their wrists. Post-mortem examinations revealed even darker truths, evidence of prolonged suffering and taunting, as though the killer wasn't satisfied with just murder. He wanted control, he wanted to leave his victim completely and utterly broken, and the locations, the killer's eerie choice of staging grounds, seemed chosen to mock the town's attempts to feel secure. A soccer field now ringed with police tape where children once played. A long-forgotten picnic spot by the lake that once saw family reunions and laughter, now overrun by forensic teams, snapping photos and collecting samples. These weren't random dump sites. They were calculated, almost ceremonial, each one leaving the town more fractured than before. Then came the fourth victim, a single mother who worked late shifts at the town diner and lived paycheck to paycheck. She was discovered near a row of abandoned storage units on the outskirts of town. Her co-workers described her as someone who always smiled despite carrying an impossible burden. This time, the brutality seemed amplified. Cuts were deeper, wounds were sharper. Every violent act exuded a simmering rage that left the investigative team shaken to their cores. Whoever was doing this wasn't slowing down. He was escalating. The police scrambled to find connections between the victims. At first glance, they appeared random, different backgrounds, different routines, no shared workplaces or friends, but then subtle patterns began to emerge. Many of the women were loners or lived in isolation with little to no immediate family around. Easy targets. Several had financial struggles or jobs that required them to walk home late at night, often through poorly lit parts of town. Vulnerable. And most disturbingly, all bore signs of psychological torment, humiliation, and deliberate dehumanization before their deaths. The killer didn't just want to kill, he wanted to dominate. As the body count rose, the sense of panic bubbled over into public hysteria. Those who could afford it installed home security systems, extra locks, and motion-activated cameras. The streets emptied earlier each day, businesses shuttering before sundown. Mothers picked their kids up directly from school, no longer trusting the safety of a short bike ride home. The once vibrant community now pulsed with fear, the weight of the unknown predator sitting like a shadow at every dinner table. Ironically, what made these murders so horrifying wasn't only the violence. It was the fact that they happened in places that were supposed to be safe. These were scenes you'd expect in gritty inner-city headlines, not in the idyllic bubble of suburbia. It was that collision between the serene and the sinister, the white picket fences framing scenes of horror, that made these crimes feel so deeply personal and violated. For weeks, detectives combed through the evidence with little to show for it. They scoured cell towers and cross-referenced alibis until they could barely keep their eyes open. But the killer, whoever he was meticulous. He left only the smallest breadcrumbs, the faintest indications of where he might strike next, keeping law enforcement perpetually one frustrating step behind. By the time the town had its fifth victim, a retiree who had spent her last days volunteering at a local animal shelter, this killer was no longer just an abstraction, a character for people to whisper about over coffee cups. He was a monster, flesh and blood, haunting the lives of everyone who lived in this once quaint suburb. His existence turned neighbors into suspects, friends into enemies, and the community into an outpost of terror. Yet even as fear spread like wildfire, one question loomed over everyone's thoughts. How much worse could it get before he was stopped? The portraits of the victims. When the case first began to unravel, the victims were little more than names on police reports or stark black and white photographs pinned to corkboards in the precinct. But as the investigation deepened and the details of their lives came to light, these women transformed from faceless casualties into deeply human stories, stories that should never have ended the way they did. In the picturesque quiet of suburban life, they were anomalies. These women weren't the neighborhood moms attending PTA meetings or the cheerful shoppers you'd wave to at the supermarket. They weren't the types who melded seamlessly into the fabric of suburban normalcy. Their lives often carried a difficult, rugged duality, surviving quietly on the fringes of society while passing through the very heart of it every day. The survivors of a harsh reality. Many of the victims grew up battling challenges life had stacked against them. Several had fallen off the trajectory of what one might call a good life, taking jobs that were taxing, underpaid, and often unseen by those around them. These were the housekeepers scrubbing floors for the upper middle class, the late-night diner waitresses pouring bottomless cups of coffee, and the single moms piecing lives together paycheck by paycheck. They lived in trailer parks or rented modest apartments on streets with cracked sidewalks and dim streetlights. Work wasn't just a 9-to-5 for these women, it was survival itself. Many juggled multiple jobs. Some spent hours walking home in the dark because they couldn't afford reliable transportation. Others, branded by life as unreachable loners, avoided close relationships, making their disappearances go unnoticed longer than they should have. One victim worked at a laundromat, folding clean clothes for families that would never feel the weight of her struggle. Another was a part-time cashier at the dollar store by the edge of town, someone locals saw regularly but to whom they rarely gave a second thought. And then there was the diner waitress, a mother of two who always served smiles despite the exhaustion etched permanently on her face. These were women whose lives others barely registered. And now, in death, they demanded an attention society had cruelly denied them when they were alive, a threat of isolation. One hauntingly common thread wove these women together: isolation. Their existences, lived mostly in the shadows, made them vulnerable. Many had dwindling or non-existent support networks, estranged families, few friends, and even fewer allies. One victim, identified as Linda Ray, had relocated to the suburb a year earlier after leaving behind a history of domestic abuse. Hoping to start anew, she had no one to call when fear crept into the back of her mind on lonely nights. She was later found near a gravel pit, less than half a mile away from her one-room apartment. Another victim, Rebecca, was described by a coworker as kind of a ghost in real life. She clocked in, clocked out, and went home. No one knew much about her apart from her tendency to avoid eye contact and her utilitarian way of communicating. She didn't share birthday cakes in the employee lounge or make small talk during shift overlaps. She existed on the periphery and ultimately vanished the same way, quietly, until her body was found weeks later in an abandoned parking lot. Women without safety nets. Several victims turned to small, informal forms of off-the-books work to scrape by, cleaning unsavory motels for cash, working odd hours at gas stations, driving delivery trucks down poorly lit country roads. These women found themselves in lifelines of work that made them easy marks for someone who knew how to exploit such vulnerability. They didn't have the luxury of gated communities or security systems. Safety was often just a hope and a prayer as they walked dimly lit paths home from a night shift. In fact, 3 of the women had no reported next of kin, no one who would habitually check in on them, notice their absence, or even realize something was wrong. When they vanished, it was the community, that is to say distant employers or austere landlords, who first noticed, if anyone did. She didn't show up to waitress this week, or her overdue rent piled up, were the first alarms set off for some of these cases. Dreams and desperations. These lives, though marred by their struggles, were not devoid of dreams. Marilyn, who regularly visited the used bookstore by the post office, had been saving up for a train trip to Chicago. She hoped to visit her sister, whom she hadn't seen in over a decade. Cynthia, another victim, carried a locket with photos of her nephews and nieces back in Texas, a symbol of the family she could only afford to visit once every few years. These were women with something in their hearts guiding them forward, even if life had repeatedly let them down. One particularly gut-wrenching case was that of Caroline. Caroline had grown up in foster care and, as those close to her knew, had been trying to save money for hairdressing school in a bigger city. She wanted out. She dreamed of leaving behind the layers of judgment people heaped upon her for her backstory. But her dreams, and her life, ended in the dense copse of woods behind a long-abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. The notebook in her purse, carrying the rough sketches of hairstyles she had wanted to try, was found with a thin layer of frost over it on an early winter morning. The serial killer's type. Though outwardly the victim seemed unconnected, certain patterns emerged that gave investigators their first real foothold. The killer's preference for solitude, poverty, and vulnerability. Almost all the women fit the psychological profile of what the FBI would later call ideal victims for predators who look for isolation. They were women without backup plans, without people hovering over their every move. The killer must have known this. He targeted women he could lull into the shadows, who he knew wouldn't be missed right away, who had fewer resources, and even fewer avenues of escape once he began his assault. Chillingly, it wasn't just physical desolation that made the victims easy marks, it was the emotional desolation too. Women who had been forced to carry the emotional labor of survival alone for years were prime targets for a predator who thrived on manipulation and control. A community torn over the why. As news of the victims became more public and as their faces began to appear on local TV, questions lingered in the minds of most townsfolk. Why these women? Why not someone more noticeable, more important? The sinister undercurrent of these questions betrayed a deeply uncomfortable truth about society's perception of value. In death, attention was paid to these women that they had never been afforded in life. In trying to answer the killer's why, society reckoned with its own indifference toward people who lived precariously on the fringes. And yet, for every face shown on the evening news, grieving co-workers and the handful of estranged family members who remembered them would shout, they mattered, they had struggled, yes, but they mattered. Common patterns, and the killer's disturbing modus operandi. What terrified investigators the most, and later captivated the grim fascination of true crime enthusiasts nationwide, was the terrifying precision and planning of the killer's methods. This wasn't someone striking on impulse or losing control in a moment of rage. No, this was premeditated, deliberate, and chillingly clinical, leaving a calling card of terror that suggested the work of a disturbed yet highly intelligent predator. The forgotten places, the killer's stage. One of the most unsettling patterns that emerged early in the investigation was the choice of locations where the bodies were found. The killer didn't dispose of his victims in open spaces or even attempt to hide them in deep, remote areas that might make discovery less likely. Instead, his preferred dumping grounds were the forgotten places of suburban life, the edges of the ordinary world where no one dared to linger. There was the overgrown soccer field where kids used to play, now abandoned and fenced off with rusting goalposts. The shadowy corners of old bus depots, where vines crept over derelict fencing. The thick patches of woods that hugged the suburban streets where teenagers once dared each other to explore, now avoided as superstition turned into fear. The killer seemed to thrive on co-opting these spaces, turning what was once mundane into set pieces for a grotesque tableau of violence. The killer's choice of these areas wasn't just for convenience or some random decision, it was almost ceremonial. Investigators and profilers believed the locations were a critical part of his process. Each dump site was a twisted form of communication, meant to taunt the community, to disrupt their sense of safety, and to remind them that evil lurked among them, unnoticed, until it was too late. No random victims. Yet another element that made the case so unnerving was how specific the killer was in selecting his targets. While to the untrained eye the women might have seemed like a random assortment of individuals, it quickly became clear that his victims were chosen with painstaking intention. For starters, all the victims shared a profound vulnerability that made them easy, silent targets. These were women living on the edges of society. They were solitary figures, women who walked alone, often after dark, due to their work schedules or because they lived in areas without reliable transportation. Loneliness seemed to be their defining trait, making them invisible to most people. But not to him. The pattern became undeniable. His victims were often in their late 30s to mid-40s, women pushing against life's harsher odds. They were not the glamorous, attention-grabbing types you'd expect in a story so infamous. Instead, they were diner waitresses at the end of their shifts. They were custodians cleaning office buildings after hours. They were single mothers leaving the back exit of the supermarket after their shifts, stocking shelves. He selected women who, intentionally or not, had fallen through the cracks of suburban intimacy, out of sight and out of mind to the world around them. A calculated approach. Perhaps most disturbing was the finesse with which the killer executed his crimes. According to profilers brought into the investigation, the killer must have been someone meticulous, patient, and eerily comfortable with stalking and lingering in the periphery. He would study his victims, learning their routines, understanding their vulnerabilities, and then strike with precision. He didn't drag his victims into his world without preparation. Instead, he lured them. Sometimes it was under the pretense of needing help, like offering to carry something heavy to their car in a dark parking lot. Sometimes it was through fake vulnerability, portraying himself as a man lost or in distress. Once the women let their guard down, the shift was immediate and horrifying. He'd incapacitate them swiftly, either choking them unconscious or bludgeoning them with a weapon he'd prepared in advance. From the moment he acted, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. His methods left little behind for investigators to follow. There were no haphazard footprints in the mud, no careless fingerprints smeared on nearby surfaces. Each crime seemed almost surgical in its execution, leaving only the hellish aftermath of the victims' broken bodies for police to discover later. Control and humiliation, the psychological marker. What struck investigators even more deeply than his physical precision, however, was the psychological cruelty present in each of his crimes. This wasn't a killer driven solely by the desire to murder. His crimes revealed an almost ritualistic obsession with control and humiliation. In nearly every case, the victims' bodies told stories that went beyond violence. They told stories of degradation. From the bruises and ligature marks, it was clear that these women had been bound and tortured, sometimes for hours before death mercifully freed them. The man was a sadist, deriving pleasure not only from the killing but from the act of stripping his victims of their humanity. This need for domination carried over even after death. Disturbingly, the killer staged the bodies in ways that profilers believed were meant to evoke shame or mockery. He left them exposed, often in positions that turned their last moments into a grotesque display. Tattered clothes were crudely rearranged or missing altogether. He used their broken bodies as a twisted canvas to paint his own story. A story of power, control, and perhaps, in his own mind, revenge against an invisible enemy only he could see. It wasn't merely an act of taking a life. It was an attempt to rewrite the identity of his victims, to transform them into symbols of his own darkness. Escalation of brutality. The killer's violence wasn't static, it evolved. Profilers noted a clear escalation in the level of brutality with each successive killing. Early victims showed signs of blunt force trauma and strangulation, likely meant to kill them quickly. But as the murders continued, the wounds became more and more frenzied. Post-mortem mutilation appeared in later victims. There were deeper cuts, prolonged suffering, and evidence that pointed toward a need to inflict psychological terror as well as physical pain. This escalation suggested an emboldened killer, someone who felt untouchable and invincible. He was no longer satisfied with simply killing. He was experimenting, pushing the boundaries of his own depravity. Hiding in plain sight. What made the case even more unnerving was the chilling realization that, throughout all of this, the killer could very well have been someone the community saw every day. A neighbor glimpsed taking out the garbage, a man buying a coffee at the local diner, someone who waved friendly greetings but watched the residents with cold, assessing eyes. This calculated invisibility was intentional. He wasn't some deranged figure skulking in the shadows with blood on his hands. He blended in, camouflaged by the same routines and gestures that were part of the suburban fabric, creating the perfect mask of normality to hide the monster beneath. An unrelenting grip of fear. The combination of precision, psychological cruelty, and invisibility created a storm of fear that broke apart the fabric of suburban community life. Neighbors suddenly saw each other with suspicion. Could it be the man a few houses down who makes just a little too much small talk? Could it be the guy sitting at the back of church? Every interaction felt shadowed by doubt. As for law enforcement, they couldn't afford to let their frustration show, but it was clear they were chasing someone who not only knew the boundaries of their capabilities, but enjoyed toying with them. With every new victim, it felt as if he was sending a message. Catch me if you can. The panic takes hold of the community. At first, the townsfolk weren't sure what to make of the news. The discovery of a single body, gruesome as it was, didn't immediately shatter the fabric of the closely knit suburb. People whispered about the tragedy, speculated about accidents or someone from out of town, passing through with ill intentions. But when the second body turned up, and then the third, it became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a string of unrelated incidents or crimes of passion. This was something far worse. This was a pattern, and when words like serial killer began slipping into local conversations, the community's unease exploded into full-blown panic. Living in the shadow of fear, life in the once peaceful suburb began to change overnight. Streets that had been full of bikers, joggers, and kids playing street hockey in the pale evenings now fell eerily silent after sunset. Porch lights blinked on earlier than usual, illuminating empty driveways that might have once been filled with conversation and laughter. In a place where people knew their neighbors by name and waved to each other while watering their lawns, now doors were bolted, curtains were drawn, and trust evaporated like morning dew under the growing heat of paranoia. For women especially, life felt like it had shifted into a different timeline altogether. They were advised, by the police and by the news stations, to avoid walking alone, especially at night. Parents, once content to let their teenagers hang out at the town's diner or park after dinner, now demanded they return home before dark. The unspoken fear wasn't just of the killer himself, it was of the dark spaces he might inhabit. No one wanted to be caught unaware. No one wanted to be the next victim. Neighbors began forming informal watch groups, patrols of well-meaning dads and retired veterans driving slowly through neighborhoods late at night, their headlights cutting through the shadows. But their unease was palpable. What chance did a flashlight or a radio have against someone capable of such unspeakable evil? The rumors fuel the flames. As the community became more insular, the rumors grew louder and wilder. Everyone suddenly became a suspect in someone else's eyes. That recluse down the block who never mowed his lawn? Maybe he knew more than he let on. The single man who lived alone in the cul-de-sac and never attended the neighborhood barbecues? Definitely suspicious. The handyman who always seemed to be fixing fences or roofs in the area, with no shortage of excuses to show up at people's homes. He too wasn't above suspicion. The presence of a predator turned everyone's routine into a question mark. Trips to the grocery store became exercises in caution. Did the man in line behind you seem a little too intent on your movements? Did the guy parked at the diner stay in his car a little too long, like he might be watching who's coming and going? Somewhere between vigilance and full-blown paranoia, the community began to fray at its edges. Local online forums and Facebook groups lit up with anxious posts. Someone's floodlight had caught a strange figure by their backyard fence. Another resident swore there was a suspicious van parked a little too long outside an elementary school. "Has anyone seen this man?" a post would read, paired with a blurry photo of what might have been someone checking their mail. No lead was too small, no nervous observation dismissed as trivial. Yet despite the flurry of shared fears, there were no real answers. The shadow predator, dubbed as such by the growing media frenzy, was as elusive as he was horrifying. Suspicion, tears at the core of trust. The damage wasn't just external, it seeped into the relationships between neighbors and friends. People began locking their doors earlier than usual, sure, but what was worse was the way trust began to erode. It was as if an invisible wall had been built up between former allies. The cheerful nods exchanged across grocery store aisles were replaced by solemn glances or averted gazes. Conversations between neighbors became guarded. Women in particular avoided too much eye contact with strange men. The thought nagged at everyone like a splinter. What if it's someone we all know? At one point, even the mailman, a man who had delivered letters to the suburb for over 15 years, had to face the stink of suspicion. Someone stirred up a theory that the killer might be someone who knew the area well, who could canvass neighborhoods unnoticed. Wouldn't the mailman be a perfect cover? He stopped receiving the smiles and greetings he once did, and instead found himself under silent stares whenever he passed. At barbershops and Sunday service, hushed conversations took a more morbid tone. "It has to be someone local," people would whisper. "Someone who knows all our routines." The fear wasn't just of the unknown anymore. It was the sinking thought that the monster might live among them. The constant media spotlight. If the community's paranoia wasn't enough, the media made sure to pile onto the growing tension. Reporters swarmed the town, parachuting in from major networks to feed off the story of a small-town suburb losing its innocence. Microphones and cameras hung on every police statement, no matter how insignificant. The blinking red lights of news vans became a common sight at each new crime scene. National coverage amplified everything, turning what was already a local nightmare into a media spectacle. Anchors debated the psychology of the killer, panels of experts speculated wildly about his motives, and true crime podcasts raced to chronicle the horror in real time. To outsiders, it was chilling entertainment. To those who lived there, it felt like their fear had been put on display for the whole country to feast on. A desperate scramble for security. In a town that once prided itself on its simplicity, a quiet suburban life that didn't need high fences or alarm systems, home security became a booming industry. Hardware stores were quickly cleared out of deadbolts, window locks, and motion detection lights. DIY surveillance cameras sprang up on more porches than seasonal decorations ever had. Families dug deep into their savings to afford systems they'd never imagined needing before. Blinking panels that beeped out commands, glass brake sensors on every window, and even backyard floodlights that made the quiet streets feel oddly theatrical. For some, it wasn't enough. A few families packed up and left altogether, unwilling to stick around and see how much worse things could get. Others, locked into mortgages and lives they couldn't abandon, simply lived under the weight of unease. Everywhere you turned, there was a quiet acknowledgement that life here had fundamentally shifted. The expectations of suburban innocence, the idea that a small town could be both quaint and untouchable, wrapped in white picket fences and free from the sins of the outside world, had been shattered beyond repair. How far could it go? All the while the underlying tension loomed. How would the killer escalate? Would it only happen under the cover of night, or would he grow bold enough to snatch someone in plain sight? The questions haunted every resident, building into a hysteria that gripped the community tighter than ever before. More than the crimes themselves, it was the unknown that paralyzed the town. The killer hadn't just murdered, he'd transformed the fabric of daily life. What once brought joy, an evening walk, a solo drive home, a quiet moment by the lake, now carried an invisible but suffocating weight. Nothing could truly feel safe again, and as night fell each day and the streets emptied faster and faster, the town waited for another loss, another body, another intrusion into the illusion of safety they had all taken for granted. The difficult trail of clues. For law enforcement, the cold reality of the case set in quickly. This killer was no amateur. The evidence left at the crime scenes, though horrifying in what it revealed about the brutality of the murders, offered little in the way of measurable progress. Early on, the police felt like they were fighting a ghost. No fingerprints, no eyewitness reports, no obvious connections between the victims beyond their tragic ends. It was as though the crimes had been committed by someone who was a step ahead at every turn. The first few weeks were brutal. Officers worked around the clock combing the sites where the bodies were discovered, straining their eyes at every snapped twig and overlooked cigarette butt. Forensic technicians pored over every inch of evidence, the way the bodies were staged, the impressions left in the dirt, even faint scents lingering in the air, yet almost every lead led to a dead end. The killer had left behind a nightmare, but not the kind of traceable trail police could pin down. DNA evidence, a long shot in the dark. The only substantial clue came from forensic biology. Traces of semen had been recovered from the first two victims, offering a potential DNA profile for the killer. But even this victory came with its own frustration. At the time, DNA databases were still in their infancy. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, which linked state and national databases, wasn't as comprehensive or as robust as it would be years later. The technology that modern crime dramas promised didn't always match reality. A match in the system? Negative. The DNA profile earned the police little more than a placeholder, a phantom blueprint of a man who did not yet exist in the records. It provided hope, but little else. The forensics lab confirmed the DNA belonged to the same individual in all cases analyzed. That consistency, while chilling, at least confirmed law enforcement wasn't chasing multiple killers. This was the work of one man, but who he was remained a maddening enigma. A pattern emerges. Barely meanwhile, efforts to find ties between the victims started proving slightly more fruitful. Detectives worked tirelessly to map out their routines, interviewing co-workers, distant family members, and the few friends or acquaintances each woman left behind. The goal was a simple one: to find a commonality, an overlap that could point toward the killer. At first, everything seemed maddeningly random. The victims didn't frequent the same stores, take the same bus routes, or get their groceries from the same supermarkets. Their social circles didn't intersect. They even lived on opposite ends of town. It was only after weeks of painstaking work that the minutiae began to show a faint thread of connection. The women were all, in some way, isolated. They didn't have roommates or close confidants. None of them owned a car. Each of them often walked alone on dimly lit paths late at night, whether coming home from a shift at the diner, finishing errands, or simply getting off the local bus. That all-too-common vulnerability was the crack through which this killer had slipped. Small clues in forgotten spaces. The locations where the bodies were left behind became a secondary focus of the investigation. If this killer had a signature, perhaps it could be found not just in the violence he inflicted, but in where he chose to reveal his awful work. The abandoned soccer field, the overgrown woods, a desolate gravel lot by a disused factory. These weren't random discards. They were deliberate choices, profilers suggested, intended to send a message. Why these places? Detectives theorized the killer must have been familiar with these locations, using them as a sort of twisted stage. Each was remote enough to suggest he wasn't afraid of discovery. If anything, he seemed meticulous in selecting areas that were once public but had long since been forgotten, places where life used to flourish but had now turned hollow and abandoned. Police canvassed nearby homes and businesses for security footage, though the dated equipment and limited technology of the time made this an uphill battle. And again, they ran into walls. No grainy footage captured a suspicious figure. No stray car tire imprints turned into a lead. No disheveled stranger spotted near these sites in the hours before or after. Interviews yield frustrations. With no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no direct evidence pointing to the perpetrator, investigators turned more heavily toward the community for answers. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Residents, transit workers, gas station attendants, even distant acquaintances of the victims were carefully questioned and encouraged to report any suspicious activities, no matter how minor they seemed. Some sightings were reported, but they often amounted to little more than whispered rumors and half-formed suspicions. "I think I saw him, someone strange, lingering by the grocery store last week," one woman told investigators. Another said, "There's a guy who walks past my house. Always seems like he's watching, but maybe I'm just paranoid." Each story, vague and incomplete, was catalogued and investigated. But the problem with a town gripped by hysteria is that everyone starts seeing monsters in the shadows. He could have been anyone. Too many of the reports were colored by fear, rather than fact. Profiling the predator. Enter the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. By now, the killer's uncanny ability to evade detection had caught the attention of state and national authorities. Profilers were brought in to assess not only the behavior of the killer, but also to provide insight into why he may have chosen his particular victims and methods. Their expertise painted a darkly vivid picture. The man they sought, they said, was almost certainly a loner. He lived on the social periphery, isolated, bitter, and likely harboring deep resentments against society, particularly against women. His planning and patience suggested a high level of intelligence. Profilers envisioned someone who had spent years developing his fantasy of control and execution until he finally acted on it. He thrived on the fear he created. The staging of the bodies, in particular, seemed to point to a need to dominate not just his victims, but also the community itself. Every gruesome reveal served as a warning and a message. I am watching, and I cannot be stopped. Missteps and red herrings. Inevitably, as the case dragged on, dead ends began stacking up. One man was arrested after matching a somewhat generic description provided by a concerned neighbor. He had a criminal history of misdemeanors and lived just blocks from one of the body sites. For 3 long days, the police interrogated him, combing through his belongings, desperate for any evidence that he was their man. Only after an ironclad alibi surfaced did they let him go, clearing him with obvious reluctance. The missteps fed public discontent. People wanted answers. Months passed, and as no arrests were made and no new developments surfaced, confidence in the investigation began to erode. Each false accusation further clouded the waters, making it harder to discern genuine tips from baseless hysteria. The waiting game. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the investigation was the crushing weight of waiting. There was no telling when, or if, the killer would strike again. Sleep-deprived detectives spent their hours poring over files and re-examining witness statements, hoping a detail they'd overlooked before might reveal itself. Patrol cars rolled endlessly through neighborhoods, their flashing lights a constant reminder of the threat that still loomed. With every passing day, the tension inside the precinct grew heavier. Each morning brought with it the dread that another phone call would break the silence. A jogger discovering a body, a mother reporting her sister hadn't come home, another forgotten space turned into a scene of horror. The room where the case board stood, filled with victim photos, evidence markers and pushpins linked by looping red string, turned suffocating. Officers couldn't avoid staring at it, tracing the lines, hoping the web of connections might finally snap into clarity. But the killer seemed to know. Every move the investigators made was anticipated and countered with silence. It was as if he were playing a game, one in which he always stayed one step ahead. The clues were there, but each one was buried beneath layers of darkness, denial, and fear. The pivotal witness and the first breakthrough. For months, the investigation seemed to be running in circles. Detectives were chasing shadows and following leads that dissolved into nothingness. The atmosphere in the precinct was heavy with frustration, the walls full of pinned photographs and looping string that did little to answer the question on everyone's mind: who was he? The killer's careful, calculated nature made him appear almost superhuman, always eluding capture while leaving a trail of shattered lives behind him. That is, until a miracle, if one could call it that, stepped forward. A survivor. A witness. A woman who had escaped the clutches of the shadowy figure that had haunted the town for months. A narrow escape from death. Her name was Teresa Williams, and she was a single mother of 2, working double shifts to make ends meet. One cold November evening, her car broke down on a quiet, unlit road on the outskirts of town. She was stranded, frustrated, and anxious about being late to pick up her kids from her sister's house. It was the type of setting that most people in the community had grown to dread, a perfect storm of vulnerability, isolation, and bad timing. Teresa had just finished calling for roadside assistance when a vehicle pulled up behind her. A man stepped out, waving a flashlight and offering to help. He was unassuming, polite even. He commented on the chill in the air as he examined the hood of her car. "You're lucky I came along," he said with a small, disarming smile. At first glance, he seemed like the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about. A lanky man in his early 30s wearing worn jeans and a faded jacket. He looked like someone you might see at a gas station or hanging out at the local diner. Teresa hesitated, but ultimately accepted the help. After all, this was a quiet town, wasn't it? The kind of place where people still helped each other out of a jam. Her momentary trust turned disastrous in an instant. The man's demeanor shifted like a breaking storm. One second he was fiddling with the jumper cables, the next he swung a crowbar at her, narrowly missing her head as she stumbled back in shock. He grabbed her with terrifying strength, pinning her against the car, his voice sharp and menacing. He didn't say much, but his eyes conveyed everything Teresa needed to know. She wasn't supposed to leave that road alive. What the man didn't count on was Teresa's sheer will to survive. With every ounce of strength she had, she fought back, raking her nails across his face and delivering a swift knee to his groin. His grip loosened just long enough for her to break free, sprinting down the road into the darkness. The headlights of an oncoming car were her salvation. She waved them down, screaming, and the driver hurried her to the nearest gas station to call the police. By the time officers arrived on the scene, the man, and his vehicle, were gone. Piecing together a description. Teresa's escape was the first glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak investigation. Hospitalized for minor injuries, rattled but alive, she became the key witness in a case that had seemed unsolvable. Through her detailed recounting, detectives were able to piece together the first tangible description of the man they had been chasing for so long. He was average in height, slender in build, and likely in his early to mid-30s. He had a pale complexion, with short, sandy-colored hair, and a narrow face. Teresa also noted a prominent scar on his left cheek, something she hadn't caused but had been there before their confrontation. His voice was calm and measured, devoid of any accent that stood out, which somehow made him more chilling in its normalcy. Detectives sketched a composite image based on her account and circulated it among patrol units and local authorities. Teresa also remembered the vehicle, a battered blue pickup truck with rust eating away at the wheel wells. Though she hadn't seen the license plate, she vividly recalled a decal on the rear window, a faded image of a pine tree surrounded by a circle. The town reacts to the breakthrough. When the news broke that someone had survived an encounter with the killer, the atmosphere in town shifted. It was a bittersweet mix of relief and horror. On the one hand, the fact that Teresa had escaped alive was a sign that the killer wasn't infallible. On the other hand, her story, and the sheer terror embedded in it, made the threat feel more immediate than ever. Teresa's recounting painted a vivid picture of just how calculated and deliberate the predator was. He didn't stumble upon his victims by chance. He sought out moments of vulnerability, broken-down cars, late-night walks, poorly lit bus stops, and positioned himself as a savior before striking with clinical precision. To the residents of the suburb, this revelation was a punch in the gut. Who hadn't been in a moment of need like that? Who wouldn't have fallen for the guise of kindness that he wore like a mask? A tangible lead. For the first time, investigators felt they had something to work with, though the path ahead was still murky. The key to cracking the case now lay in finding the battered blue pickup truck Teresa had described. Officers began combing through vehicle registrations in the area, looking for any vehicles matching the description. Patrol units spent nights scouring neighborhoods and backstreets, keeping an eye out for the distinctive rusted truck. Simultaneously, detectives began zeroing in on men who fit the physical profile Teresa had provided. In small towns, people rarely go unnoticed for long. Soon, questions were being asked. Who had scars like the one Teresa described? Who was driving battered old trucks? And more importantly, who seemed just a little too familiar with the town's routines and hidden corners? Challenges and doubts. Despite the momentum Teresa gave the investigation, there were still challenges. Her encounter had taken place at night, in a moment of fear and chaos. Could her memory truly be trusted? Some officers worried about the reliability of her recollections. Was the scar on the left cheek, or was it less prominent? Was the decal on the truck a pine tree, or might it have been something else entirely? Even small discrepancies could send investigators down the wrong path. Still, her story breathed new life into a case growing dangerously cold. It was the first blinking light in a tunnel of darkness, a sign that the killer wasn't untouchable after all. The ripple effect of a survivor's strength. Perhaps most significantly, Teresa's survival changed how the town viewed the threat. For months the killer had been an anonymous shadow, a ghostly menace no one could picture. Now, thanks to Teresa's courage, that phantom had a face, a vehicle, a method. He was human, capable of mistakes, and while the image of him was terrifying, it gave the community something tangible to fight against. From that moment on, the investigation took on a new intensity. The battered blue truck became the most sought-after vehicle in town. Patrol officers scanned every driveway and parking lot for the rusted relic. Quiet streets that had once felt devoid of evidence now seemed rich with opportunity, every corner holding the possibility of a breakthrough. The killer revealed, a loner among society. For months the investigation had danced on the edges of clarity, teasing the idea that the shadow predator might finally meet the light of exposure. Thanks to the key testimony of Teresa Williams and the ensuing fervor of law enforcement, the image of the killer began to sharpen. Pieces of the puzzle once obscured by fear and ambiguity now fell into place, revealing not just the face of the monster but the fractured psyche behind his horrific actions. What emerged wasn't a mythical figure of evil, nor an inhuman specter that had haunted the collective nightmares of the town. The killer was frighteningly real, an ordinary man hiding behind the banality of daily life, blending seamlessly into the faceless background of suburban normalcy. A name to the monster. His name was Mike Carlson. To most people who encountered him, he wasn't memorable in the slightest. In his mid-30s, Mike was an average-looking, almost plain man, slim build, pale complexion, short, sandy blonde hair. However, there was one prominent feature that those who interacted with him couldn't forget: a scar slashed down his left cheek, running from the corner of his eye to the cusp of his jaw. It was the very detail that had stood out to Teresa Williams during her harrowing encounter, the physical clue that linked her assailant to the predator investigators were hunting. Mike worked as a mechanic at a small, unassuming repair shop on the outskirts of town. To his co-workers, he was an enigma. Rarely friendly, almost never engaging in workplace banter, he performed his job with a quiet competence that allowed him to fly under the radar. He clocked in, did the work, and left. Few people truly knew him. For some, his withdrawn nature was cause for mild suspicion, but it never tipped into outright alarm. Neighbors described him as the kind of person you don't think about too much. He lived alone in a decrepit trailer on a barren plot of land just outside the city limits. His home, much like him, seemed deliberately nondescript. Dark curtains always drawn, the yard littered with overgrown grass and forgotten tools. The only consistent sound from his property was the low hum of an engine being tinkered with late into the night. A loner among society. Mike Carlson was the embodiment of isolation. He had no close friends, no romantic connections, and, as it turned out, no family left to hold him accountable. Born into a troubled home, Mike's childhood was marked by neglect and intermittent abuse from his alcoholic father. His mother, overwhelmed and beaten down by life's weight, vanished when he was just 10 years old. She left no note, no goodbye, just an aching void where love and security should have been. By the time Mike reached his teens, he had earned a reputation as the quiet kid in school, the one who sat in the back of the classroom, avoided group activities, and always seemed on the fringes of any social circle. Teachers would later recount how unsettling his silence was, how his stare lingered a second too long, as if he saw the world through a filter no one else could recognize. His classmates, unkind as teenagers often are, targeted him for mockery, making his scar the focal point of their cruelty. This relentless cycle of ridicule and invisibility carved out the foundation of who Mike Carlson would become. He wasn't just a loner by circumstance, he embraced it. Society had pushed him to the edges of its comfortable boundaries, and instead of fighting his way back in, he built a fortress of bitterness and rejection in those margins. Beneath the surface, digging into his life, investigators discovered an unsettling inner world that spoke to years of smoldering anger, pain, and perverse ideology. Inside Mike's trailer, police recovered journals, a haunting archive of his thoughts and plans, and meticulously organized trophies of his victims. Photographs, locks of hair, even small personal items like keychains and lipstick tubes filled boxes hidden in his closet. Each item had been labeled with a date and location, detailing precisely when and where he had claimed them. It was clear Mike didn't kill impulsively. He was a predator who stalked the routines of his victims with a shocking level of forethought and calculation. His journals chronicled his fantasies, his need to assert control, and his twisted rationale for choosing his targets. The language was chillingly detached, as though he saw himself not as a person but as an agent of some self-imposed justice. What stood out most to the profilers combing through his life was how deeply rooted his hatred was, not just of women, but of the world that had sidelined him. His victims weren't random, they were symbols. In his mind, they represented the society that had discarded him, the classmates who had mocked his scar, the mother who had abandoned him in his weakest moments. The violence wasn't about his victims personally, it was about making the world feel the pain and humiliation he believed it had unleashed upon him. Slipping through the cracks. What stunned investigators, and horrified the town, was how easily Mike had evaded detection, even as the body count rose. His ability to blend into the fabric of suburban life wasn't born from charisma or cleverness, it was sheer invisibility. Mike lived in isolation so absolute that his day-to-day life barely registered with those around him. He never shopped in large stores, opting instead for mom-and-pop shops on the outskirts of town. He avoided social functions, gatherings, or any situation where someone might take too close a look at him. Even his co-workers, tasked with standing next to him for hours on end, often described him as shadowy, a presence you only remember in hindsight. This anonymity allowed him to move among his unsuspecting neighbors without raising alarm. A battered blue pickup truck, a scar, a quiet demeanor, none of it stood out until it was too late. the small-town shock. When word began to spread that Mike Carlson, the quiet mechanic whose name few uttered, was the shadow predator, the town collectively recoiled. The carefully curated image of their suburb as a wholesome, safe community cracked under the reality that one of their own had turned their trust into a weapon. "It's always the ones you least expect" became a common refrain at coffee shops and barber shops, but even this refrain felt hollow. No one really expected anything of Mike Carlson, not because he was unassuming, but because he had effectively removed himself from their world entirely, the perfect storm of a killer. In the end, Mike wasn't the mythical mastermind some had feared. He was the byproduct of neglect, pain and rage compounded over years of loneliness. What made him so deadly wasn't supernatural brilliance or strength. It was the invisibility he had crafted around himself. The mechanic, the prime suspect. As the investigative net tightened around the small suburb, a name began surfacing again and again. Mike Carlson. He wasn't a stranger to the investigators. His name had come up in earlier interviews with locals due to his solitary, almost eerie demeanor. But without direct evidence to tie him to the crimes, he had initially been disregarded as just another recluse who fit society's mold of suspicion. However, focusing on leads from Teresa Williams and an intensified effort to narrow down suspects changed everything. What began as mild curiosity about the quiet mechanic quickly snowballed into a dark, damning spotlight that positioned Mike Carlson as the prime suspect, raising red flags in routine canvass. The first real breakthrough came when investigators started their sweep of local garages and mechanics to follow up on Teresa's description of the killer's battered blue pickup truck. The small repair shop where Mike worked was easy to miss. Nestled between a shuttered convenience store and an abandoned ice cream stand, it was the kind of place only locals frequented. It wasn't flashy or particularly inviting, just a dusty building with a dirt-streaked sign and a garage door that squeaked audibly when opened. The officers noticed Mike immediately when they entered the shop. He fit Teresa's description alarmingly well. Average height? Check. Sandy blonde hair? Check. Narrow face? Check. And then their gaze locked onto his scar, a long, faded gash running diagonally down his left cheek. For the officers it was like staring into the composite sketch that had been haunting them for weeks. His truck, a weathered blue pickup with rust peeling around the wheel wells, matched Teresa's description almost too perfectly. And perched on the rear window was the faded pine tree decal she'd mentioned, a detail so specific it sealed their focus squarely on him. The quiet enigma. Mike's co-workers described him in terms that felt almost cliché for a murder suspect. Kept to himself, wasn't much for talking, and always clocked in on time. But the more detectives pried, the more unsettling the picture became. One mechanic noted that Mike often worked alone in the farthest corner of the garage. While the rest of the team would chat during breaks, Mike would either sit in his truck or disappear into the back of the shop. He rarely shared personal details, seemed allergic to small talk, and never so much as attended the occasional beer nights at the local dive bar. A co-worker once asked him where he'd gotten his distinctive scar, but Mike had only smirked and replied, "Can't remember, might have been a fight." The other employees had stopped asking questions after that. Though no one outright accused him of wrongdoing, a lingering unease permeated their interactions with him. What took the suspicion from eerie to alarming were the peculiar items Carlson often kept in his truck or toolbox. A crowbar, lengths of frayed rope, duct tape, and a well-worn flashlight, tools that could have had perfectly normal uses for a mechanic but, in the context of Teresa's story and the mounting murders, took on a more sinister connotation. His solitude became a weapon. Detectives looked deeper into Carlson's life outside of work. He lived alone on the outskirts of town in a dilapidated trailer parked on an almost forgotten stretch of land. His nearest neighbors were half a mile away, and even they admitted they barely saw him. One elderly man remembered waving at Mike once, only to be ignored completely. "He wasn't unfriendly," the man said, "just like he didn't care to exist in the same world as the rest of us." No one in town recalled him being in a relationship or even attempting one. His days seemed singularly focused on work, with an eerie quiet filling the gaps in between. That solitude allowed him to disappear into the background. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Mike was a ghost, rarely noticed, seldom remembered, and entirely underestimated. The search for evidence. While circumstantial evidence pointed squarely at Mike Carlson, investigators knew that without something concrete, he would slip through their fingers. The fact that his truck matched the description given by Teresa was compelling but not enough for an arrest. They needed something more, a smoking gun. When detectives obtained a warrant to search his home and truck, what they found was damning. Inside his truck, they discovered dirt particles and vegetation that forensic analysts quickly identified as belonging to one of the crime scenes. More disturbing still were streaks of what resembled blood beneath the truck bed liner. Swabs were immediately taken for analysis, but it was his trailer that raised the stakes. As officers combed through the dilapidated space, they found a grim inventory that read like a checklist of a serial killer's toolkit. Lengths of frayed rope matching patterns found on victims, rolls of duct tape with traces of hair embedded in the adhesive, a collection of knives, some stained with residues they would later confirm through luminol testing as blood traces. And then there was his private stash, a weathered cardboard box tucked beneath his bed. It contained small personal items investigators immediately recognized as trophies. One officer pulled out a lipstick tube engraved with initials that matched one of the early victims. Another found a delicate bracelet with a broken clasp, reported missing by another victim's family. It was a treasure trove of horror, carefully curated like a scrapbook of his crimes. Building the psychological profile. As more evidence mounted against Mike, behavioral profilers pieced together the eerie motivations behind his actions. Mike wasn't a spur-of-the-moment killer. He was someone who lived and thrived in the margins, meticulously observing the routines of potential victims. He targeted women he viewed as vulnerable, whether they were walking home late at night, stranded with a flat tire, or isolated by social circumstance. His work as a mechanic gave him the perfect cover to scout for victims without raising suspicion. Many of the women he followed had cars that needed repair or frequented areas where vehicle troubles were common, remote parking lots or poorly lit roads. His isolated lifestyle and non-existent social ties meant no one tracked his comings and goings. Confronting the predator. When detectives brought Mike in for questioning, he was calm, too calm. He denied knowledge of the murders outright, his responses clipped and emotionless. Yet his demeanor began to crack when they confronted him with the evidence, the soil samples, the trophies, and the DNA they had pulled from his truck. Carlson's calculated mask began to slip. He fidgeted with the cuffs of his shirt, avoided eye contact, and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After hours of interrogation, he uttered his first loaded words. "You think you've got me figured out, don't you?" That cracked veneer signaled to investigators that they were close. The town's shadow comes to light. As evidence continued to pile up, Carlson's secrets unraveled in tandem with the town's sense of security. Residents who once barely noticed him now spoke of him with growing dread. How could someone so unremarkable, so invisible, have existed in their community as a predator for so long? Mike Carlson wasn't the deranged, sinister villain of a Hollywood movie. He was worse. He hid in plain sight, blending into the mundane fabric of daily life while harboring unimaginable darkness. The hunt and the final psychological chase. The moment Mike Carlson emerged as the prime suspect, the nature of the investigation shifted dramatically. What had once felt like a desperate search for a ghost in the shadows became a deliberate, calculated chess match. Detectives were no longer stumbling in the dark. They were now stalking their prey. The hunt was on, but they knew capturing Carlson would require precision, patience, and an understanding of the psychological game they were playing. Mike wasn't the type to bolt at the first sign of trouble. He had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background. But now, with each step the investigators closed in, cracks began to form in the calm, invisible mask he had worn for so long. The tension between predator and pursuers mounted, turning the investigation into not just a physical chase, but a mental war. Closing the net, law enforcement knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to bring Mike Carlson in. He had been too careful, too calculating, leaving behind only faint traces of his crimes. The items found in his trailer and truck, rope, duct tape, bloodstains, suggested horrifying truths, but they needed confirmation. DNA analysis was expedited, with forensic labs working around the clock to match the blood found on his tools and truck bed to known victims. While waiting for those results, investigators began tightening the physical net around Carlson. Surveillance of his habits became a top priority. Patrol vehicles were stationed near his trailer, their presence obvious at times to send him a message. "We're watching you." Detectives shadowed him to and from work, cataloging his every move. Mike's routine was unnerving in its simplicity. He left his trailer each morning just before 7 a.m., driving the familiar and now infamous battered blue pickup truck to the auto shop where he worked. There he spent hours isolated in his corner of the garage, methodically repairing engines and avoiding co-workers. At the end of the day, he'd return to his ramshackle trailer, disappearing behind its closed doors. There were no late-night grocery runs, no stops at bars or diners, just eerie, predictable solitude. The monotony of his routine frustrated detectives. They expected a sign of nervousness, a slip in control as the investigation closed in around him, but Carlson remained maddeningly composed. It wasn't until the police began ramping up psychological pressure that the cracks in his demeanor started to show. The psychological battle begins. To someone as reclusive and guarded as Mike Carlson, privacy was power. Investigators understood that the key to destabilizing him was to invade the fragile bubble of control he had built around himself. The first move in the psychological game came when detectives began interviewing people in Carlson's life. His co-workers, neighbors, and even the occasional cashier at the gas station down the road were questioned extensively. The presence of law enforcement, coupled with the implied suspicion aimed at Carlson, spread like wildfire through the small town. This wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about pushing Carlson further into a corner. He had spent his life hiding in plain sight, operating as an invisible figure in the background, but now everyone in town was talking about him. Whispers of his odd behavior, speculative stories about his past, and nervous theories about what he might have done created an invisible web of pressure that grew tighter each day. The next move came when police started making themselves more visible around Carlson. Patrol cars parked conspicuously near his garage, sometimes just idling as mechanics came and went. Detectives showed up at his shop under the pretense of asking follow-up questions about unrelated vehicle issues, their true purpose being to rattle him. A neighbor caught Mike peeking through his curtains late one evening, his face lit by the eerie green glow of a television he never seemed to turn off. Carlson's neighbors reported small but significant shifts in his behavior. He began pacing the small patch of dirt outside his trailer at odd hours. His usually mechanical morning routine grew erratic. Some days he left earlier than usual, other days he lingered for hours before driving off. The man who had once seemed eerily calm and predictable was now showing signs of anxiety. Mind games and manipulation. The investigative team knew they needed to keep the pressure on. The goal wasn't just to unsettle Carlson, it was to lure him into making a mistake. They began calling him in for interviews under the guise of follow-ups. These interviews were carefully orchestrated psychological battles. Detectives didn't outright accuse him of the murders, at least not at first. Instead, they circled around him, asking vague, open-ended questions designed to make him question how much they knew. "Mike, can you think of any reason your truck might have been spotted near one of the crime scenes?" one detective asked casually during an early session. Carlson simply shrugged, claiming he often drove through those areas on his way home. Another time they slid a photo of Teresa Williams, the survivor, across the table. "She said the man who attacked her had a scar on his left cheek," they remarked, staring pointedly at Mike's face. His response was as cold as it was deflective. Lots of people have scars. But Carlson's mask of indifference couldn't hold forever. Every time he was questioned, every time a patrol car lingered near the shop or his trailer, his agitation grew. Detectives could see it in the twitch of his hands, the nervous way his fingertips tapped against his thighs, the slight cracking of his voice when pressed too hard. In another interview, a detective pushed further. "Mike, you're a mechanic. You know how cars work. You think it's possible someone as smart as you could have used their truck to lure women in? Maybe someone who's good at hiding evidence?" Carlson's jaw tightened, but he refused to answer. The final psychological blow came when investigators deliberately leaked certain details to the media. News reports speculated on the identity of the killer, mentioning specifics about the truck, the scar, and the trophies. Though Carlson's name wasn't mentioned, everyone in town knew who the reports were hinting at. The breaking point. It didn't take long for Carlson to unravel. Neighbors began noticing strange patterns in his behavior. He covered his truck's rear window with duct tape to hide the pine tree decal. He disconnected the lights outside his trailer, plunging the property into darkness each night. But his most damning mistake came when he attempted to dispose of evidence. Officers conducting surveillance spotted Carlson driving out to a wooded area late one evening, a black trash bag in the bed of his truck. They followed at a distance, watching as he parked, grabbed the bag, and disappeared into the trees. When the officers moved in shortly after, they recovered the bag. Inside they found items investigators immediately recognized as belonging to the victims. torn clothing, small trinkets, and, most horrifying of all, a bloodied scarf that matched a missing person's report. Carlson's plan of control had finally crumbled, cornered by the weight of evidence. When police arrived at the garage the next morning with a warrant for his arrest, Mike Carlson didn't resist. He stood stone-faced, his scarred cheek catching the pale morning light as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. If he felt fear, he didn't show it. But the man who had spent years hiding his monstrosity behind a veil of normalcy looked smaller somehow, less menacing, more defeated. In the end, the chase for Mike Carlson wasn't merely about catching a killer. It was about understanding the psychology of a man who had turned his isolation and bitterness into weapons. The hunt and the psychological warfare that cornered him exposed not just his guilt, but the depth of his deranged and calculating mind. Irrefutable DNA evidence. The weight of a murder investigation often rests not just on witness testimony or circumstantial evidence, but on the cold, hard certainty of forensics. In the case of Mike Carlson, despite the damning items uncovered in his home and the psychological pressure investigators had placed on him, it was the DNA evidence that ultimately tied every string together with unshakable clarity. After months of chasing shadows and being forced to rely on fragments of clues, law enforcement finally reached a point where science spoke louder than suspicions. The irrefutable DNA analysis would prove to be the breaking point, sealing Carlson's fate in a way no amount of interrogations or searches ever could, building the case with forensic science. It all began with the small but crucial pieces of genetic material left behind at the crime scenes. Traces of semen had been recovered from at least 3 victims, but for months the forensic team had been waiting on advancements in technology and expediting lab processing to get a proper match. The combined DNA index system, CODIS, and other national forensic databases had failed to initially identify the genetic profile. The killer had no prior recorded offenses, leaving law enforcement without a direct suspect in the system. Still, the DNA was preserved, carefully cataloged and repeatedly tested, waiting for the right breakthrough moment. When detectives searched Carlson's trailer and truck, DNA would emerge as the silent witness that carried the full truth of Mike Carlson's crimes. Blood traces found beneath the bed liner of his truck, a bizarrely meticulous but still sloppy attempt at cleaning, were subjected to immediate comparison when technicians matched it to the earliest victim, whose death had haunted the case for nearly a year. Even more disturbing were the hairs and small tissue samples embedded in the adhesive residue on the duct tape recovered from Carlson's trailer. These were matched to 2 other victims, confirming their link to his crimes. What made this analysis particularly damning was that the DNA samples not only placed Carlson at the crime scenes, but also directly tied his actions to the physical suffering of the victims. It wasn't circumstantial. It was as if his crimes were etched into their very biology, captured forever in strands of genetic evidence. The testing that broke the case. One by one, the chain of evidence built a picture too detailed to ignore. The matches were statistically incontrovertible. Forensic analysts provided probabilities that the DNA recovered from crime scenes could belong to anyone other than Mike Carlson. Those probabilities reached impossibly low numbers, something in the range of 1 in a billion. Experts in the courtroom would later say it wasn't just a match, it was an unshakable marker of guilt. Among the clearest pieces of evidence was the DNA found on the bloody scarf that Carlson had attempted to discard in the woods just days before his arrest. It bore traces of both the victim's DNA and Carlson's. This discovery was far worse than finding trophies or tools. It was an undeniable fingerprint of an act that tied the victim to her killer. During testing, forensic investigators discovered patterns consistent with prolonged physical struggle. The scarf wasn't only a piece of evidence, it was a narrative thread that detailed the chaos and pain of Carlson's crimes. The role of advanced techniques technology became a critical ally in this phase of the investigation. With advancements in DNA analysis techniques, such as polymerase chain reactions, PCR, and short tandem repeat, STR profiling, investigators were able to isolate and amplify even the smallest degraded fragments of genetic material. This was particularly essential when uncovering samples from bodies that had been exposed to the elements, some of which had been attacked months before Carlson's arrest. One breakthrough came when the forensic team used touch DNA to recover genetic material from one of the victim's clothing. Even the faintest traces of skin cells left behind by Carlson were enough to build a case against him. It was a reminder that no amount of planning or preparation could truly erase the small but vital human errors left by a killer who had grown emboldened by his invisibility. Scientific certainty meets legal strategy. Once the forensic reports came back, the game shifted within the precinct. The DNA evidence was no longer just another clue, it became the foundation upon which the entire case rested. Detectives were now armed with weapons more powerful than interrogation tactics or psychological manipulation. The legal team prepared for a trial in which they would present this evidence as the centerpiece. The jury wouldn't need to rely on gut feelings, alibis, or circumstantial logic. The DNA analysis painted a picture far more vivid than any testimony ever could. Scientists from the forensic lab were poised to take the stand, ready to deliver data with precision and authority, to explain the statistical impossibility of anyone other than Mike Carlson committing these murders. Carlson's defiance crumbles. When Carlson was confronted with the forensic evidence during additional interrogations, the stoic mask he had worn began to crack. Up until that point he had relied on denial and silence, always answering detectives' accusations with flat denials or dismissive shrugs. But the numbers didn't lie, and Carlson knew it. He could gaslight investigators about his truck, his tools, his habits, but the DNA was immovable, impossible to argue against. "What do you want me to say?" he mumbled during one particularly telling session. He didn't admit guilt outright, but the weight of certainty hung heavily in the air. His silence in the face of damning science spoke volumes. The hammer of justice DNA evidence didn't just identify Carlson as the murderer, it brought justice to victims whose stories demanded to be told. Each match in the forensic investigation was like a voice from beyond, signaling that Carlson's meticulous planning had failed to shield him from the one element of his crimes he could never conceal. Law enforcement, prosecutors, and forensic experts worked together to structure an airtight case that couldn't be unraveled by a clever defense attorney or salacious media coverage. By the time Carlson's trial began, the DNA evidence had already sentenced him in the public eye. The move from courtroom drama to legal conclusion unfolded swiftly, cementing Carlson's role in the horrifying narrative that had consumed the town. A landmark moment of accountability. This case became a landmark not just in law enforcement but also in forensic science. It highlighted the true power of DNA evidence, not just as a tool for narrowing down suspects but as an undeniable instrument of truth. In a world where killers like Carlson operate in shadows, hiding behind whispered rumors and unsubstantiated speculation, DNA brought light to the darkest corners of his actions. For the families of the victims, the science provided closure that no apologies, no regrets, and no confessions ever could. The certainty of the results reassured them that justice wasn't just handed down on a whim, it had been written into the data, confirmed beyond any shadow of doubt. A grim message for predators. Ultimately, the DNA evidence sent a chilling message to anyone who thought they could outsmart the law. Mike Carlson's meticulous attempts to evade capture had failed, not because of luck or coincidence, but because of the extraordinary precision of science. In the modern era, DNA became the adversary he didn't see coming, the quiet observer at every crime scene that waited patiently to speak against him. Carlson's sins would live on in the genetic record, preserved for history and justice, an irrefutable sign that no matter how careful a predator might be, they could never truly erase their presence. Scientists, jurors, and grieving families alike looked at those results and knew these crimes did not belong to an imagined monster or an innocent man wrongly accused. They belonged to Mike Carlson. The evidence had spoken, and it spoke the truth. The confession and final judgment. After months of relentless investigation, psychological warfare, and damning forensic science, all roads led to Mike Carlson. The law had caught up with him. With the weight of the evidence bearing down on his shoulders, DNA matches, trophies from victims, witness testimony, Carlson could no longer afford to hide behind denial. The time had come for the monster to face not only the judgment of the courts, but also the confrontation of his own darkness. What unfolded in the small, tightly packed courtroom shocked even those hardened by the knowledge of his crimes. Mike Carlson confessed, and in doing so, he lifted the veil on the psyche of a man consumed by rage, loneliness, and a bottomless need for control, forever shattering any illusion of closure for the families of his victims. The chain reaction to a ruptured defense. The confession wasn't immediate. When Carlson first stood trial, he maintained a carefully guarded silence, clinging to the hope that perhaps his defense team might shred the prosecution's arguments. For weeks, Legal battles raged over the admissibility of evidence, particularly the forensic findings. Carlson's defense attorneys, grasping at straws, attempted to poke holes in the integrity of the investigations, raising questions about contaminated DNA samples and the fairness of the intense media scrutiny. But by the time the prosecution laid out their airtight case, it became clear that their strategy was unassailable. A mountain of evidence was displayed for the courtroom, the DNA tied directly to Mike, the grisly trophies hidden in his trailer, the damning testimonial from Teresa Williams, and even the eerie journals recovered from his possession. His own words, scrawled over page after page in his dark handwriting, unhinged and methodical, outlined his motives in horrific detail. By the time the prosecution rested, Mike Carlson was a cornered animal. Backed into a legal and psychological trap from which no escape was possible, he finally cracked. On the 6th day of the trial, after weeks of deflection and hollow statements, Carlson requested an audience alone with his defense attorneys, and later, shockingly, asked to speak to the court. With the entire room leaning forward in stunned silence, he took the stand. His confession began not as an admission of guilt, but as a chilling justification. The confession, a window into madness. Carlson opened with startling calmness, as though he were discussing traffic or weather. His voice was even and emotionless, his words frighteningly devoid of remorse. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he started, a sharp contradiction to the horrors of his crimes. What followed was a shocking unraveling of the man behind the killings, a man who viewed his actions not as evil but as righteous, as inevitable. He described the first murder as though it were an experiment. He didn't know her name. All he knew was that she was there, under the wrong set of circumstances. She was walking alone, vulnerable, a fact that he emphasized in almost clinical terms. Carlson's tone dripped with a grotesque sense of entitlement, as though the opportunities that came his way weren't terrible choices he made, but moments of universal inevitability. It was about power, Carlson confessed coldly. Not just physical power, but the power to watch the lights go out in someone's eyes, to control every moment leading up to that. He described how he would stalk his victims for days, sometimes weeks, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses. He methodically planned every step of his attacks, not just to ensure that he wouldn't get caught, but because the planning itself gave him a sense of superiority, of mastery over life and death. Carlson admitted to all 12 of the murders, shocking the courtroom further when he revealed details investigators weren't aware of. Additional moments of torment inflicted on the victims, the deliberate placement of their bodies in locations meant to haunt the community. "You think this was random?" he sneered. "Every choice I made had a purpose. Those fields, those woods, they needed to be remembered for something other than soccer games or picnics. I made them what they are now." His confession drilled into the heart of his motivation. Control. It wasn't about the victims themselves as individuals, but what they represented. "They were just pieces," he said with an unsettling smirk. "Pieces on a chessboard I could move however I wanted." The courtroom's quiet horror. The confession rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Many sat frozen, unable to comprehend the level of depravity Carlson so casually admitted to. The families of the victims, people who had waited for justice for months, who had clung to the hope of answers, broke down into tears. Some wept in grief, others looked at him with pure hatred. It was a moment that laid bare the destruction he had wrought, not just in his victims' lives but in the lives of everyone who loved them. Even members of his own defense team looked shaken. This wasn't a man fighting for his life or his innocence. This was someone who wore his guilt and his darkness as though it were a badge. The prosecutor seized upon Carlson's confession, not just as validation of their case, but as the final nail in the coffin. The jury needed no further debate when tasked with reaching a verdict. The sentenced Mike Carlson was found guilty on all counts of murder, aggravated assault, and desecration of human remains. Additionally, the court found him guilty of multiple counts of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, based on the graphic details he provided about how he'd abducted many of his victims before killing them. Given the sheer brutality and premeditation of his crimes, the prosecution pushed for the deepest sentence allowed by law, the death penalty. Though Carlson's defense attorneys attempted to argue that his mental health and childhood trauma should be grounds for leniency, the overwhelming evidence and his own chilling confession left the jury unmoved. In a unanimous decision, the death penalty was handed down. It was justice, but it didn't feel like enough for many. As the judge read the sentence aloud, Carlson showed no emotion. He stood, staring blankly ahead, his scarred face a grim reminder of the wounds others had inflicted on him long before he began inflicting his own. But in the eyes of the court and the community, Mike Carlson wasn't a victim of circumstance or cruelty. He was a predator who deserved the full brunt of the punishment he had earned. The aftermath, a town left to heal. The case was officially closed, but its tentacles of grief and unease lingered over the small suburb like an inescapable shadow. For the families of the victims, the verdict provided a sense of justice but not closure. No amount of punishment could erase the memories, could undo the loss, could bring back the people who had been stolen in such horrific ways. For the investigators it was a bittersweet victory. They had caught their killer, but the emptiness of his motivations, his utter lack of remorse, underscored a chilling truth. There was no deeper mystery here to unravel, no greater understanding to be gained. Carlson killed because he could. He thrived on despair because it made him feel alive. As for Mike Carlson, his name became a curse within the town, a reminder of the fragility of safety, of the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary faces. He spent his final years awaiting execution in a maximum security facility, isolated once again but this time by steel bars and guards. He never sought forgiveness. He never apologized. To his last breath, he remained the quiet mechanic with a secret world of horrors. The legacy of a monster. The trial and conviction of Mike Carlson left an indelible mark on the community. It became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that evil rarely announces itself in obvious ways. Carlson was proof that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they wave politely from behind the counter, or they fix your brakes with quiet efficiency. Conclusion. The cases not only reflect the deeply dark corners within some individuals, but also serve as a stark reminder of the need for vigilance and mutual protection in society. The darkness around us is sometimes not distant or unfamiliar, but comes from those who exist among us in our everyday lives.